Hello, everyone, and welcome to another program here at the National Jazz Museum in Harlem. We're excited to have you with us today. For those of you who are new to the National Jazz Museum in Harlem, we're located on 129th Street, just off of Malcolm X Boulevard in Harlem. And we are open as of October 2021. We're open Thursday, Friday, Saturday from noon to 5. So we do encourage you to come and check out our exhibitions. For those of you who would like to be members, or if you'd like to support any of the programming that we do at the museum, you can visit jmih.org and learn all about the programs that happen here at the National Jazz Museum in Harlem. And on behalf of our artistic team of Christian McBride and John Batiste, we want to get the program started today. The program today, James Baldwin and Music, the Gospel of His Literary Blues. This will be a discussion with three fascinating scholars on the impact of James Baldwin and his fascination with music. Our curator and our host for today is DJ Lynnée Denise, who is an artist, scholar, and writer whose work reflects on the underground cultural movements, the 1980s, migration studies, theories of escape, and electronic music of the African diaspora. So we will get things started here. Please welcome DJ Lynnée Denise.
Greetings and thank you so much for tuning in and for joining us. I couldn't be more excited to be in this conversation with two of my favorite musical minds and literary scholars and just sort of folks who excel in cultural studies, Black cultural studies in particular. And so I am so honored to be here thinking through Baldwin and his literary and musical mind. So thank you so much. So I'd like to start with an extended quote and then get into the panel introductions and allow our panelists to introduce themselves by way of answering a question about Baldwin's work. So I'd like to start with an extended quote from James Baldwin's The Uses of the Blues, or The Uses of Blues to Set the Tone. This essay was originally published in Playboy magazine in 1964, and my hope is that it will help us frame or at least open the conversation. Quote, "The title, The Uses of the Blues, does not refer to music. I don't know anything about music. It does refer to the experience of life or the state of being out of which the blues come. Now, I am claiming a great deal for the blues. I'm using them as a metaphor. I might have titled this, for example, The Uses of Anguish or The Uses of Pain. But I want to talk about the blues not only because they speak of this particular experience of life and this state of being, but because they contain the toughness that manages to make this experience articulate. I am engaged then in a discussion of craft or, to use a very dangerous word, art. And I want to suggest that the acceptance of this anguish one finds in the blues and the expression of it creates also, however odd this may sound, a kind of joy." So I wanted to kind of start here to anchor Black music and the blues in joy, which I believe is a kind of radical reading of a kind of music that is mistakenly understood as being rooted in the unbearable misery. So Baldwin says, we've made this music based on these experiences designed to break us, which means that the blues and its uses or its function as a cultural product is kind of a stylized way of expressing survival. And he also in the article or in the essay uses the blues to think about Black music as a lived experience and not simply a musicological topic. And finally, in the essay, he also engages the interior worlds of artists like Bessie Smith and Billie Holiday and Lead Belly, and talked about their lived experiences as being extensions of the blues or an extension of the blues. And so this framework is in conversation with Clyde Woods' notion of blues epistemology and the rendering of blues as a form of social explanation, or blues as an analytical tool through which we can begin to understand the Black experience. And so also in other essays like Stranger in the Village, James Baldwin talks about traveling with blues records in tow to Europe and listening to the blues without shame once he was able to shed the context of American racism in Switzerland, and the ways in which the shaming of the blues happened from both within and outside of Black communities, and sort of thinking about or being shamed about the ways in which the blues mistakenly, were understood as music created by a shiftless people mired by decadence and the absence of, strong moral sensibilities. But I wanted to head into this conversation thinking about Baldwin's musicality as a writer and as a thinker, and as a DJ, kind of explain my role in curating this conversation with these two great musical minds, and talking a little bit about how I came to and how I come to my understanding of Baldwin as a musical or a literary musical figure. First, I'd like to just kind of highlight some of those things and talk about why I'm drawn to his rhythm. And I feel like that rhythm can be found in Baldwin's musical use of the comma, his phrasing as a public intellectual. One could argue his bars as an MC. Baldwin's queer poetics as a musical intervention on the page, and Baldwin's commitment to and defense of Black English. And so my guest will spend time reflecting on a little bit of Baldwin's 1956 novel, Giovanni's Room, and Baldwin's final novel, Just Above My Head, which he wrote in 79, I'm sorry. So let's start again with these kind of non-traditional introductions, and use your sort of entry into the world of James Baldwin as a musical figure. Can you talk to us about how you entered this world? And we can totally start with Ed, who's written, I think, one of the most important books that I've come across in terms of me trying to understand Baldwin's relationship to music. And that book is titled Who Can Afford to Improvise? James Baldwin and Music, the Lyrics, and the Listeners. So I actually read this book in the south of France when I was chasing clues about Baldwin's life in St. Paul de Vence. And it was rich with references and analysis and unlikely connections, right? So if you could please, Ed, just talk about who you are and how you came to Baldwin's musical mind, and also what you've done in this book and your approach to the book.
Oh, gosh. Well, first of all, great to be here. Great to see you guys. And Lynnée, great to see you again. Can't wait till one day we be in the same physical space again, and to say that so happy to be here. The work you're doing in all different the channels that you do are so important to everybody, but certainly to me.
Thank you.
So, how to come at Baldwin's musicality, or how Baldwin's musicality came to me. It kind of came to me twice as starting points. The first one, I was 16 and in high school, and my family was a kind of migrant family in a way. We moved from place to place. And by the time I was in 10th grade, we had moved to a town in Wisconsin, which was all white. And I was in school and out of my element and without any now Black people within arm's reach. And because this is the mid 1980s, there was no internet or anything like that. And even radio didn't make it up to this place very well. And so I was really in very strange and intense kind of precarious circumstances, that part of my life. Okay. But out of the blue, a girlfriend of mine, she gave me a copy of The Price of the Ticket when it was first published. I think her mother had it as a reading club book or something. I knew nothing about any of this. And I was having all kinds of trouble in school. And she said something like, here, take this book. Maybe this can help you. And The Price of the Ticket was Baldwin's first collected nonfiction release. It was this massive book. And I wasn't a reader in high school. I ran for it. And so I'm sitting with this huge book, and I think I can't possibly read this thing. So let me look in here. And I looked in the table of contents to try to figure out where I could start. And just looking at titles, and the first title that caught my eye was the essay called Color. So I was like, okay, that has to be part of what the deal is here. And And that's where I started. And Color is a small little essay written in 1962 about Baldwin's experience. He was writing it from France, but really is about his experience with music in New York City and the difference between downtown clubs, which were integrated or mostly white, and uptown clubs, which were probably integrated too, but mostly black. And the ways that the music worked in those different locations in very different ways, you know. And so at Uptown, he's saying, you know, that the audience and the musicians have a relationship to each other, which is beyond the music. They know where each other comes and goes from before and after these performances, you know, and there's just a feeling of a kind of warmth and wholeness going on together with everything else going on in those circumstances, which then becomes void and absent in weird ways in other, you know, venues of musical performance. And I had never been to New York City. I didn't know anything about any of that either. But when he started to describe the different energy that takes place between people in Black musical auspices on one hand over there, and in another way over here, this is something that was absolutely, you know, at war with me at the time and felt like it was pulling me bodily into different pieces. You know, I had never read anything about that. I didn't know much about anything at that point. I was 15, 16 years old. But in those paragraphs, I was, this guy, okay, he's been here somehow. You know, he's been here before I was here. And music has something to do with this. Color has something to do with it. Culture, family has something to do with this. This is really about people's relationship to each other. And that can go, yeah. So clearly my first encounter with Baldwin at all was a kind of musical thing. And, you know, what it boiled down to was, just like you said in reading that introductory paragraph of the Use of the Blues essay, for Baldwin, music was really about experience, really about people. And through music, you could learn and index and draw together people in ways that are unique, and through Black music, you know. So that was, and the second starting point was the essay, The Use of the Blues, which was an unknown essay by James Baldwin to many and most, and almost everybody until quite recently, really. But Bruce Springsteen's biographer actually reached out to me through whatever channels and asked me, would I ever heard of this essay, Use of the Blues? And I said, yeah, I know my Baldwin back and forth, but I've never heard of that essay. What? He said, yes, in Playboy magazine on eBay, should I buy it? And I'm like, yeah, buy it, you know. So he did it, and he sent me a copy, and I this was probably 2002, 3, 4 in there. I was living in upstate New York, and I'm reading that essay, and I'm thinking, oh my God, this is so incredible. You know, how have I not seen this? And how is this not you know, an essay of Baldwin that we realize is so important and central to everything, you know? Mm-hmm. And that got me started on a project to find other essays of his that hadn't been collected. I went on one, which led me to meeting Gloria Carifa-Smart, Baldwin's younger sister. And that initiated a series of circumstances that made the, you know, the kind of mature work that I've done with Baldwin possible and start to take place in a focused way that it did. Before 2003, 4, and before These Are the Blues, before I met Gloria and we went in the direction we did, I mean, Baldwin was just like living to me. You know, I wouldn't know how even to be going through a week without constantly going back and forth with his guidance. And so with that second moment, then things became a little bit more, you know, intellectualized, a little bit more disciplined, and became, you know, the occasion for research and learning and scholarship in a different kind of way. So I got a long and kind of tangled history with Baldwin and music both, and Baldwin as music too. So yeah, to know me is to know that, I think. So that's a good way to introduce myself. I could do that. I wish I could do it more concisely, but there you go.
It's concise enough, and actually it reminds me of, you know, quite honestly, how intentional this conversation was, and gathering you two in particular, because I came to you, Ed. You had no idea that I was sitting in the audience in Paris, France, for the first James Baldwin conference. And I heard you talk about James Baldwin's relationship with Ray Charles, which we are absolutely going to circle back to. But it was your animation, your soulful understanding of Baldwin's musical mind, or Baldwin's relationship with music, or Baldwin as music. But then there is Imani, right? Yes. And I'm excited because Imani and I met officially for the first time. Was it Harvard? Was it Yale, for a conference that Dr. Ishan Crawley organized around the Hammond B3 organ? Where was that?
The first time we met not on a dance floor with loud music, because we met at Guernica a million years before that, but then it was at Yale.
You bring it back.
Guernica in the day, the Schomburg at an event, but you were playing.
Yeah.
So music, and we're both under the spell, but I had to salute you. And then Yale is finally one split second of no music so that we could meet in the quiet.
In the quiet. And that's interesting, right? Because yes, and I mean, I was trying to get to, because like Ed and I also worked together on an Aretha Franklin conference where, we invited him to be the keynote. But then I was thinking about how we landed here, Imani, and how you and I had one of the most incredible experiences that I've had as a music scholar, thinking through disco and post-disco and Black folks in the 1980s. And so I'm so excited to have you here. And I would just love to hear how you have come to Baldwin and to his musical mind and where it fits in your world.
Well, it goes all the way back. I'm born and raised in New York, and born and raised in church, though I migrated into Black church as you would conceive of it in a normal kind of way. I grew up in a small Caribbean, unusual church, but until I migrated to an AME church with Pentecostal expression, I was a child musician in church. And I thought I was a teenager. I found a picture recently that tells me that I was playing in church from maybe age 9. I don't even think I was double digits. So when I read Baldwin, maybe around 6th grade, 5th grade, Go Tell It on the Mountain, though there was no example of a woman preaching even, much less a child preacher, I knew what it was to have a role in the ritual of my spiritual community and to be an outlier in that. I'd never seen anyone else. No other children were doing it in our space, but that was my role. So I identified instantly the fact that he came from something I knew in terms of text and song. So when Go Tell It on the Mountain begins, if you don't know the book of Revelation, then you don't know that's an excerpt of the book of Revelation, followed by a spiritual, right? But if you know the book of Revelation, you're like, oh, okay. And then the character's name is John, you're instantly like lined up with the author eye to eye in a way that is different and peculiar. Because I'm reading Black authors anyway, but it's not like that, Like that was a distinct kind of lightning rod moment. And then the church he's talking about is the expressive, charismatic result of the Azusa Revival. Whether people are called Pentecostal or not, they come out of, in denominations, out of this 1907 experience in Los Angeles, under the leadership of Bishop Charles Mason, who founded the Church of God in Christ, but many things splinter out of that. And what feeds into that is African traditional religion, and African traditional religion lives inside of that, whether people know it, can accept it, or reject that wholesale. That's what's happening. If you studied both, it's both, right? So had never seen anything like that except at concerts. But my grandmother, who migrated to Brooklyn, to Bed-Stuy, as a 3-year-old in the teens, in the 1916, I believe, would always tell me a story about the Pentecostal church around the corner on Bedford Avenue, and where they would see people fall out and they'd throw a sheet on them. But this was like mysterious to me, you know, and I'd say, tell me about that kind of thing, you know, because it was foreign to our church life until it became the church life that I walked into, probably right around when I read Baldwin. And that's where I've been in church otherwise. So the other piece that's important is the price of the ticket, which I can hear my mother calling us, my sister and I, come here, girls. The Birdsongs made a film about James Baldwin. Now, Alexa and Joy Birdsong, who were sisters, Alexa was a student of Baldwin's at Mount Holyoke, are involved in the making of that film, and their mother and my mother worked together. So they were teenagers, we were littler, but we knew them. And we had sat down as a family, my mother, my sister, and I, and watched that film. And it just rocked my world. And by then, you know, I'm a teenager. It's like really unusual to be called in to sit down and watch PBS with your mom, but what an experience to have intergenerationally. And as far as the music of his work, I think of Morrison's writing about what he did and her own saying that what her aim was to function the way the music used to for Black folk. And that it is the arc of safety for ways of thinking, for ways of knowing, for secret concerns and messages that will not be tainted, erased, transformed, unless we say so, because they're not in the written record, they're in the oral tradition. So I think that when Morrison, who did that so well, salutes Baldwin's having done it, it's the bellwether for me as to who he was. And that he then is talking about critics, he'll listen to critics when they understand Ray Charles. If Ray Charles is the high authority, what did Aretha say? He's the sure enough right reverend, ain't he?
Right.
And if our musicians are the sure enough right reverend, it means that music is the place where the people's deepest and most important knowledge lives. You know, and it continues to live. So that's where I would put it.
Yeah, I'm gonna have a hard time here because I don't want to talk. Like, wait, this job of moderator is a little difficult because the seminars or sermons, if you will, that you all just gave in your introductions is why these traditional bios don't really do it. My question is, how did you come to the work? And you gave us, right, a living narrative and the history and the context. So, well, I have, several things here to move from. I was going to ask Ed to kind of help us think through Baldwin's relationship with Ray Charles. And we'll come back to that because there's an extensive chapter in the book about his Ed's book about his relationship with Ray Charles. But maybe, Ed, if I can have you do a couple of things in this answer, and I'm going to have you both do a couple of things in these answers, okay? So we're trying to give it volume in these answers, so feel free to be long-winded, and I know that we'll get there. But I want to talk about, Ed, and have you think about what we should know about 1956 Imani's room as it relates to music. How can we understand the role and the place of music in that? And I want to also have you talk about how you approached Baldwin's relationship to Bessie Smith, Billie Holiday, and Dinah Washington. Now, I know that those are, right, different parts. You can answer them, as you see fit.
Yeah. Well, one of the weird things about Who Can Afford to Improvise as a book is that there are so many weird things about that book. That book, so much happened to me in all kinds of ways at once, rather than the opposite. I can't even begin. with that. But the central thing is that it's not a book in which Baldwin and Black music is a subject. It's a book in which Baldwin and Black music is the method. Mm-hmm. You know, and so I was saying, and somewhere in the book, and probably more than one place in that book, I say, look, this is not about looking for places in Baldwin's work where he mentions music. Okay. That's all great. And people have done that and will continue to do that. And there's mountains of work like that to do still, very, very important and interesting stuff. But I was looking at the kind of the musical structures and musical wisdom, and what Imani was just talking about, how music is this channel through which wisdom and presence is transmitted in ways that history can't police and obstruct. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to focus the book in the moments in which that was most powerful for me in my reading and my hearing of what he was doing, both in life and in books and in speeches and in films and various places. So, you know, Baldwin is at his most musical, often in passages and paragraphs where we're not really talking about music as such. We're talking about people, you know, mm-hmm. and what happens to people. Mm-hmm. And also, you know, when it comes to the beautiful things that Toni Morrison and others, but maybe most profoundly, and right after he was dead, she was talking about this, what Baldwin did with language, you know, and how it was for Baldwin that his work with language was usually, you know, he was working with the words, but for him, he was really trying to transform assumptions that are beneath the language we're using. And how can we make it so that the things that words point to and radiate back into the language and change the language? He's basically says, you know, at some point he says, to be a writer and Black writer in English is to be at war with the assumptions of the language you're using. And how do we fight that? And clearly for Baldwin, it was, you know, it was the warrior assumptions were musical ones, or our access to those things were in musical terms. And so, you know, for me, the deep work in relationships and language that Baldwin was doing was just musical in its fibers, you know. So it wasn't the question of trying to find this song or that song or this singer or that singer. So how is he singing? What song is he singing, and how do we hear it? You know, what's it telling us? And so you know, that's a big part of it. And in that, I think it's pretty clear to me that Billie Holiday is in Baldwin's work and in his body, you know, in his chemistry, kind of the most one of the most. But I would say if I had to choose one, I'd say she's the most powerful actor in this project of his in musical terms. I just, you know, when it came time to name the artist, he named Billie Holiday again and again. You know, he called her a poet, called her artist, and he said, you know, it's her genius at the recreation of experience. She takes what you're living through, she puts it through her chemistry, comes back out of her mouth, and you hear it, and it means more now than it did before when it was just your life. Mm-hmm. So she gives you back your life in clarified and intensified terms, according to logics and structures that were beyond everybody, certainly beyond her. You know, Billie Holiday wasn't able to sit down and tell you about this over breakfast, but she was performing it every night. She was performing it on these records, and it lives now, and it will keep living. Mm-hmm. And I agree with that. I think she's the most important 20th century American poet there is. I think she did more with the language we speak that we can really use and live with than anybody else, period, for more people, you know? So she, and, you know, therefore she does show up named and in lyrics and in presence in his work in pretty widespread ways and in very important ways, you know. Bessie Smith too, Aretha Franklin later, Ray Charles, especially in the 50s and 60s, you know, a host of other artists named and unnamed. But Bessie Smith, Billie Holiday, and Aretha, Ray Charles, and then you mentioned Dinah Washington. You know, she's one of their chapters. Mm-hmm. Yeah, she's in there. She's in there too. So you know, I can talk in all of those directions. I guess, you know, Billie Holiday, the idea of experience recreated and given back to people in a way they can recognize, in a way that takes them beyond the thing they used to recognize before encountering it in her work. Bessie Smith, just, you know, the one of the foremost practitioners of the blues that he was talking about in the paragraph that you began with, and the idea that the blues as a artistic, I don't know, cue for what he thought was a fact, that no matter what you're going through, if you can figure out a way to tell yourself the truth about it in a way that other people can recognize, you're in actually a very powerful position, no matter what your position is. If you are not run over by your experience, but you can voice that experience, figure out a lyrical way to move through it. How is the world doing you? If you can come up with a symbolic utterance that gets to that for you and other people can recognize it, that is the place where some very powerful things can happen. And, you know, Baldwin says, we wouldn't think it would happen, but in fact, the lyrics of these kinds of miserable things create, however odd it may sound, a kind of joy. And then he says, I'm talking about joy. I'm not talking about happiness. This is a different thing. This is an existential surprise that happens inside of people and then takes place between people that can get you over. And has gotten people over generation after generation in ways that American logic would say are very unlikely. But Black musical logic shows you very, very logically how this is the case and why it's the case, and in precise instances where it is the case. So Bessie Smith, you know, presiding over that kind of thing. And Dinah Washington for Baldwin, you know, I think she's in his work in more limited ways. But I just think about the just razor sharp verbal acuity of her voice, of her work, and of her performances. And Baldwin saying, as a writer, just to turn in phrases on a dime like this is what I want to do, is what we have to do, you know. The songs that cued me to her presence on his pages, at least, were Trouble in Mind on one hand, and the great Blow Top Blues. I'm a woman who blew a fuse. I've got the Blow Top Blues. It's a great, great funny song, and it comes up in Tell Me How Long the Train's Been Gone. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, they were exactly the same age, and I thought it was strange, just kind of historical anomaly that that the use of the blues as an essay came out just within days of Dinah Washington's death. So they had these interesting kind of important dates in common. And Dinah, of course, is in a way one of Aretha Franklin's mothers, you know, musically and personally and all that. So, like I say, it's a small world or big family, no matter which way you want to look at it. But then if you want me to say a few things about Giovanni's Room, I'd like to do that too. Giovanni's Room is a strange novel in musical terms because there's very little music in it.
Right.
And I've learned to read Giovanni's Room in a way which sheds some very surprising light, and I think very, very useful light on Baldwin's own biography, which he was never forthcoming about. That might be a somewhat different discussion. But I think in David and Hella, at least, the American characters, white American characters that are in Giovanni's Room, I think in a way, what Baldwin's working with there is, you know, what is the predicament and possibilities of people who don't have ready access to the things about the importance of Black music that we're talking about, you know? And the portrait is not a pretty one. You know, the possibilities of these people are drastically limited in ways that even Baldwin's characters in their most dire predicaments sometimes aren't limited. You know, I'm not sure how David makes it out of the prison he's in when that book begins and ends. And all that happens in that book is we kind of illuminate the prison he's in. But I don't think he is going to make it out of that prison. And Hella is in the cell next door. And I don't think she's going to make it much farther. But what's interesting is, in very tantalizing ways to me, Giovanni's Room and Sonny's Blues are really Baldwin works would share exactly the same part, chronological place. They're written within, finished. Giovanni's Room was published, and Sonny's Blues he's working on within months. And the narrator of Sonny's Blues is in a condition not unlike David, really, except that the narrator has a brother and a father and an uncle and a mother, and a wife and a dead daughter, and he's tried to really put himself in the position that David finds himself in with everything he had, but he can't. And better for him, because when it comes time to find his way out of that terrible detachment from life and world and self that both those characters are in when we meet them, he, through the music, through his connection to the music, which is people, most proximately, Sonny, his brother, the piano player, he can find his way back to a living condition. And so either in Sonny's Blues, in a very short space, that narrator makes great moves. And the characters in Giovanni's Room, they are not making great moves. And I think in some ways, it's as easy as the fact that Baldwin's saying, man, these white folks, if they're living like the world's telling them to live, they ain't got no connection to this stuff. And good luck with your trust fund. Mm-hmm. And man, good luck if you ain't got one. Mm. But even if you do, and maybe in some ways, especially if you do, you're in a cage that history has really hidden in very, very terrifying ways from you and everybody else. So there's that. But the other thing about Giovanni's Room is that when Jacques, the kind of queen, in the gay underworld of Paris, and Giovanni's Room, says to David, "Oh, you keep playing it safe, you're going to find yourself trapped in your own dirty body." We think that's a comment on David's sexual life, and of course, in the book and in the world, it is a comment on that and being closeted in the ways that he was. But Baldwin was in really no sexual closet in his personal life at all. At the time that book came out, he was in exactly that predicament, and he couldn't figure out how. It was a political predicament he was in, aesthetically and personally. But what's interesting is the next move Baldwin made after suicide attempts, owing to his position in the condition that Jacques had diagnosed, basically. His response was to get a ticket back to New York and get an assignment to take him to the South, to start looking into these churches where these nascent revolutionaries in Montgomery and different places were doing this strange new work they were doing, which was also very old work. And so it's really interesting to me. The first move Baldwin makes after Giovanni's Room is to, Sonny's Blues is published exactly the summer of '57 in Partisan Review, when Baldwin is in New York, come back from France, in New York, waiting to go on his first tour of the Deep South. He had never been in the American South before. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting, the first move he made historically and biographically after Giovanni's Room and Sonny's Blues was to the South. And fantastically, in Sonny's solo at the end of that story, the narrator is saying, through Sonny playing this, I'm getting my first look at where we come from as a family. We only know the first generation of that, but his story goes way back. And he's pointing to the South where he's never been. Mm-hmm. And it's almost as if Sonny's solo and Sonny's Blues is kind of shining the light where Baldwin then in his own life will go. Mm. According to logics that he really never was writing about at the time, but are only available and most powerfully available in comments by Jacques, even by Hella, who says, I'm sick of being in places for no reason. Being in Spain's great, it's beautiful, but I'm sick of being in places for no reason. That sentence fits absolutely and precisely into James Baldwin's first person autobiography in that exact moment. And he's like, let me start exploring places I can go where I have a good goddamn reason to be there. Yeah. Even though everything in my career is telling me, why would you do that? And everything in my body is telling me they're going to kill you down there. Mm-hmm. for 10 reasons, you know.
No, and
But he went.
let me stop you there because I think that's an incredible place for us to kind of shift. And actually, you answered the hell out of the questions that I posed, and did a beautiful blend of sort of these ideas, these places, right, and the way in which they come alive on the page in 1956 and beyond. And I am guilty of approaching your book looking for his references to music. And I loved that I wanted to start from that place, digging for those references as one would dig through the crates, which is at the core of my work and jobs. Or I was digging through the crates of Baldwin's references to Black music. And I do the same thing for Toni Morrison because I want to know very specifically what these people who I hold to be literary giants are saying about this thing that keeps me alive that I love so much called Black music. And of course, you and Baldwin are thinking about Black music metaphorically, as he states in Uses of the Blues. And of course, method, right? Black music as method is a part of how you craft and create and produce this book. However, in your book, I am able to learn about more of James Baldwin's record collections, where he does reference Black music, what you found in the archives at the Schomburg that has, for example, or that includes letters that James Baldwin wrote to his brother David about how Aretha Franklin makes him feel, how Malcolm X makes him feel, how it is related to, his understanding of the blues or uses of anguish and or uses of pain and how all those come together on wax. I love that. I found that. And you introduced me to another way of understanding Black music and Baldwin's role in it, and different ways to engage that and different things to look for in my digging through the crates of his musical life and references. And thank you for kind of pulling from Giovanni's room and giving us a place, I think, to think about one of my personal favorites, which is Just Above My Head. And I don't know how to not think about Imani when it comes to this particular text. And of course, Ed, you and I emailed each other when Aretha passed, and we began a whole relationship around thinking about who those characters were and are and how they play out in Black life. But I am particularly interested, and Imani, I just want to hear where you are, and please feel free to take your time with this, because there is a sometimes uncomfortable emphasis placed on Giovanni's room as being this super groundbreaking work around queer life. And of course, that is true. There are white characters. I think that is part of the hype and the acceptance of that text. Mm-hmm. But to the erasure and to the exclusion and to the detriment, I believe, mm-hmm. of 1979's Just Above My Head, which again is Baldwin's final novel. Imani, can you please walk us through Just Above My Head and kind of talk about his approach to queering Black church aesthetics and the kind of Southern power, speaking of Ed's, kind of discourse around Baldwin's geographical movement or regional movement. Can you talk about the Southern power of gospel music in that text and just tell us what we need to know about Just Above My Head?
Yes, I love this novel because it centers gospel music, and it's kind of a time capsule because it centers quartet singing and the transition from the quartet to the soloist. So it begins at the kind of during Dorsey's lifetime. Thomas A. Dorsey, the former MD for Ma Rainey, who creates gospel in Chicago. He's from Georgia, but during his lifetime, he is working with choirs. That's the kind of standard, the gold standard of gospel music is choirs, because they can perform in churches because churches already have choirs. However, the way the music is transmitted is via soloists. And that's the record store. The record store at that time is Mahalia taking the song and the sheet music and demonstrating a song at a church where church musicians come hear songs and say, I'll take that one, I'll take that one, I'll take that one. Fascinating, first of all, to me, because of the use of notation. Wild. Like in Black American music, there's a constant stream of people using notation and people not. But I think we see the not a lot more than we see the notation. We know that we've seen Quincy with scores, and certainly the scores of After the Dance are legendary, you know. And I'm saying After the Dance, which is the single I'm particularly enamored of, but I Want You, Marvin Gaye's brilliantly arranged record. But we think of this music as not being on the page, but it was on the page. So knowing that, the soloist is in kind of a funny character because the soloist bears the brunt of people's ire and resistance rooted in anti-Blackness to gospel coming into the church versus hymns. Because gospel unites the form of all of these people sitting here like they might have been in Martin Luther's church on a choir stand with the reality of Black people's communal singing that goes in some other directions. It has other chords, it has other tendencies. There's call and response, there's infinity in it. There's a vamp that has no reason to end. So the soloist, who's the, like I said, like kind of the record store, the peddler of this form for intents and purposes, is the messenger who gets shot. And so it's very interesting to me that Arthur and Jimmy are church musicians. Ultimately, Jimmy is like a church musician in exile because his family's gone missing and his story is happening like in a vacuum, in a very strange, secret, unspoken way in New Orleans. And then when he comes back, he's kind of fast forwarded into adult life by having only his sister and Hall as adults in his world. But they're centering as church musicians and as a couple and as a fated destiny for one another is a pulling back of the curtain on what Black church music actually is anyway, which is a space where queer people have shaped this very space and then made magic within it, whether known or unknown, whether their identity in public and in church included that part of their selves. We know that it has been communicated, you know, in various true ways to us that these are queer folks and that the work itself was queer. The work itself was queer. It was socially and artistically queer. It was resistance. So the thing that struck me reading just above my head this time is that I didn't feel like I was reading when a passage of music came up. I just heard it, right? So that's blurring the line between my own sonic memory and my literacy. But also that is my literacy. And I think that is a kind of Black literacy, that there is nothing we are doing. If we didn't have music, it wasn't real. There's nothing we are doing that is significant as a community where music is absent. Unless we're having silent retreat, I guess we could do some spiritual practice, but you better believe there's music before and there's sure enough music after. Because that, and I loved, Lynnée, I thought of you, the mention of the Wiz at the end. Hall's family goes to see the Wiz. And I am obsessed with the color changing scene in the Wiz. And I think of it in terms of what I call song dance. It's not useful really for us to discuss music and not say that for Black people in the diaspora often, on the continent often, for many peoples on the planet, these things are not separate. They are not distinct. They need not have two words. So I say song dance to mean
yes,
both. And when I say music, I mean song dance. So that color sequence where they're changing colors, and I think of that as song dance being their axis, and they just move around it. And that is a metaphor for how Black life moves for communities. And so their musicality, when Julia is at the piano, when we first see her, their musicality is so extreme that Julia's a preacher, as far as we know. Julia's a model, she's an actor, she's an expat returned, but she's at the piano talking about what the great musician did and played, and able to replicate that to some degree where it wasn't laughable, it was recognizable to Hall as an extension of Arthur's expression. And what a magnificent thing to have music be so wall to wall that you don't even have to talk about somebody's capacity for it, because it is embedded, it's built in. So I just read it this time, really hearing it in preparation for our conversation. And it was like somebody was just changing records on me, or the choir was switching songs, or sometimes it was the congregation. And what a beautiful metaphor for how I perceive Black life as a place where the music is constant. And what changes is who decides what we're listening to at the moment. But music is not going anywhere.
Well, I want us to pause with sonic memory as Black literacy. I want us to pause with that because I am at a loss of words, and so I'm just going to allow us to let that sit. Sonic memory as and Black literacy, song dance as Black music. And yes, just above my head for me, I threw the book across the room several times because of the way that the story unraveled or came together, in the way that Black church secrets remain as a kind of subtext, and that, incest and sexual assault, and then within that, a complex Black queer relationship. Mm-hmm. And so for you to talk about it as almost, not even almost, for you to talk about it as a listening practice, for you to talk about reading it as a listening practice, is profound and profoundly true. For my experience with it, it is the Black church on the page, and when we talked a little bit about it yesterday, you said Kojic, right? It is absolutely the church of God in Christ in literary form, and all of the shadows and all of the light that comes with that. And so what I would like to do now, which might be probably one of the most difficult things that the three of us have ever tried to do, which is to talk a little bit about Amazing Grace. Mm-hmm. And, I think that it's a good way to end the conversation, though it just opens us up to so many more kind of layers of Baldwin and Aretha and the Black church and Just Above My Head and the story, the question of first person, and right. So like that, all of these things I think come together in a strange way, because say, for example, I have read, when digging through the crates for those musical references, the fact that Baldwin not only owned, but wore out Amazing Grace. I said he wore it out, right? And I wore out Amazing Grace. And I know for sure that the three of us collectively have probably listened to Amazing Grace 1,000 times. That's a lot of listening. And so I would just love for us to, you know, and I'll just start a little bit by, you know, talk about what Amazing Grace is. We can connect it to Baldwin or not, just because Baldwin is in it. But I want to say that for me, I have always been in love with the relationship between Detroit and LA, yes. Right? To take that Bible funk from Detroit and place it in Watts with your good friend James Cleveland, when your father has a new Bethel Baptist church, and this is your first production, right, that you fought for, right, to be seen as the producer, though you, Aretha, and your sisters have been producing your albums, right?
Uncredited.
For decades. Yes. So we have a kind of liberation happening here, right? And I just want to say that I was intrigued by the tenderness between James Cleveland and Aretha, the Black church secrets surfacing through the entry of Reverend C.L. Franklin, right, and the wards, and the musicality of the choir, right, are not to mention the presence of Mick Jagger, which just simply, you know, like stood out to me as, once again, you know, folks are in the pews or in the, you know, in the front row learning. But yeah, so Amazing Grace, I thought was just a way for us to end the conversation. So and we can start with you, Imani, if you can just say a few words about what it is, where it is, how you hear it, how you see it, how you read it. Amazing.
Okay, well, I would say that the Baldwin quote that comes to mind is, "I've got to be a witness to what I know." Mm-hmm. And the church saying that, I know that I know that I know. And that's where Aretha is situated when she's in church. And so it's her deep, true self, but also a first self. Not to say she didn't have later deep, true selves, but a deep, true first self that shows up there. And I would say also that Aretha is another capital city of Blackness, so and of music. And music and Blackness have this in common. They're gossamer. You're not always going to see it, but you will always feel it. And she is an essence of either of them at any point, and both simultaneously. What I find most staggering in Amazing Grace is that she only sings. There's that split second where she's making sure that they have the right chord in the rehearsal footage. And she turns to Alexander Hamilton and says, is that what we said? Are you sure? But that's it. There's no conversation. There's no preamble. James Cleveland sets her up. And then she is so in it. And she is so well spoken for by her music making that there would be nothing for her to add were she to be, you know, asked to give comments. There's nothing left. She wrung that thing out in the most beautiful and dimensional way. And I love seeing her at the keyboard and listening to her and James Cleveland switch off at the piano and really hearing that heavy left hand that, you know, she says he showed her how to play when he was a teen and staying at their house. And she has a distinctive pop to her left wrist. And it's just so gorgeous to see them united in that moment where her hand's behind her back and James Cleveland is holding her hand. And the other moment where he finally throws his washcloth. All of these things are just like incredibly poignant and powerful if you recognize what it means to bring a washcloth someplace.
Right.
And I just want to say that church, when I'm talking about Baltimore, and also when I'm talking about Amazing Grace, is not just the building. And it's not just Christian, and it's not even always religious in that organized kind of way. I think of church, when I'm saying it, as the way Snoop uses it as an exclamation. I feel like he was one of the first people to say that, just church, exclamation point, like punctuation on the point that something important happens here. But I equally would say you could find church out of doors, in the dance floor, on the dance floor, in the skating rink, etc. So church, exclamation point, in church, physically, is what happens in Amazing Grace. And that's why it's amazing to me, like beyond the record, which I know every note of. What a glory to see what we had only pictured. And I always pictured the choir as huge. I made that choir 3 times bigger at least.
Interesting. Wow.
I always made it 3 times bigger, which is crazy because their names are in the liner notes. But I made it bigger. I made it bigger. And to see the intimacy of that moment and to be brought into the sanctuary with them was a gift.
Wow. Yeah, church, the verb, right? Yeah, wow. Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, so when you say Amazing Grace, you're talking about the film.
I am talking about the film that became the album, the visual for the album.
Yeah. Well, as you know, I've got a lot to say about that film and what it adds to the album. And for me, ever since that movie came out, and I saw it first through Alan and Robert, some of the producers, before it was released, when the family had finally agreed, I had a link to that thing in Dropbox, and I watched it one fall day. I think it might have been right. Anyway, I can't remember the exact. It was a November day. I remember putting it on my laptop and watching it, and I thought I knew that album. I thought I knew that music, and I had listened to that, especially parts of that album, hundreds and hundreds of times. But I was totally unprepared for seeing it like that. It was the same way that when Gloria, Baldwin's sister, gave me all those letters to David, and I took them home in 2010, whenever that was, and I had read and reread everything Baldwin had ever written, of course, and a lot of stuff wasn't even in books. And I had listened to all his speeches. I'd memorized half those speeches. And when I started turning the pages of these letters when he's talking to his brother about his life, I had the same experience. Like, I don't even know, who is this guy? Like, I'm totally unprepared for this. So I had to get back on my feet. And I felt that way about that film, and still do in some ways, feel that way about that film. So for me, ever since seeing it, I've been going, when I've had time, I've been going from the film to the album, as you know, Lynnée, to the complete discs, that really present a documentary, pretty much full audio documentary of those performances. The album, a reduced mix and reproduced mix, and then the film, another kind of reshuffled mix. And interestingly, the film and the album are almost identical in length within seconds. So, and the complete thing is like triple the length, basically. And I think that because I had never really listened to the complete Amazing Grace stuff on discs, I had the album or the CDs of that album, and then the film. And I think part of why I was so unprepared for the film had to do, of course, with the visuals and everything like that, which was so incredible. I didn't expect the vests, the choir with the Sun Ra kind of space age vest coming in. It's so awesome. And the comedy of it, and just the multiple kind of layers of pleasure in it. But also the film does reproduce the music in ways that weren't redone in New York, you know, in preparation for the album, which really makes a difference. And man, you know, we all talk about Aretha's remakes, The Thrill Is Gone, of course, Respect, the great remakes that she did over a life, but rarely have I heard people talk about that version of Marvin's Holy Holy she did, and not the album version. I'm talking about the film version, or the one on the complete discs, the real live version, where she boiled that song back down into a straight spiritual. This is a song about the collective destiny of a people. And now in the moment, 1972, given what everybody's been through in the last, you know, few years, given what we think we see heading up here in the near future and beyond, I mean, just the first, which is to say, just the first like 5 minutes of music, or 3 of that film, are just absolutely mind-blowing. And, you know, she's pretty much recomposing that. I'm sure she had ideas, right? But she's recomposing that at the piano in solo terms. And I think in ways that have everything to do with her return to the church as church. And for my whole life, you know, like my most serious involvement with that kind of Pentecostal energy is in underground house music dance venues from when I was a kid in Chicago, and all these queer DJs and the people that congregated around them. That was where I really learned in my own body and with other people around what was going on in those churches. And then when I would visit real churches, you know, charismatic churches, Black churches, here and there with family and friends and so forth, you know, I recognized that, but that wasn't the common experience for me, because my family's not from such a church like that and all that business. And also, you know, soul music and gospel and their relationship to each other. My whole life, I was a person who really viewed it all as sacred, you know, in a way, or thought I did, and thought I knew, and thought I really believed that. But watching Amazing Grace and watching Aretha perform in the way she did in that space, I had to kind of take it all back for a minute and say, no. I think there's a real difference. There's a real distinction here between spaces too. And I really do think for Aretha, I think that part of the reason she's not speaking and directing in the way she did in every other venue of her life was that this is a collective body I'm participating in now. I'm not the superstar, you know, virtuoso ego that I am in the world and life. This is a different space for me. And I think for me, it's her most magnificent performance, period, without any close competition. I just think she's performing there absolutely at the very peak, beyond the peak of her power. And I feel in ways, and I think for similar reasons, just above my head. I think that's James Baldwin's greatest achievement. I don't think there's anything even close. And the violence that book has taken from all sides all these years is a disgrace. Even down to our old Delta paperback we've had to put up with having the wrong character names on the back of the book for all these years. What is that about? So, you know, in I'll just say this, when it comes to Just Above My Head, the similarity is that, you know, you can find obviously autobiographical relationships with Baldwin and all of his work, of course, and sometimes very explicitly and sometimes in ways that are veiled in the fiction, and also family relationships in there for sure. But Baldwin really did keep a kind of wall between his real relationship to his brothers and sisters and his mother. His father's in a somewhat different space, but his brothers and sisters, his nieces, nephews, and his mother were in his life apart from his career and his work. And he used that to stabilize the chaos he was going through and to give himself at least the imagined idea of a place to go back to where there are no questions on the table, you know. And in Just Above My Head, he took that wall away. And now his family really flowed into and for Baldwin always, of course, insisted that he was a novelist first. And I think we should take his word. I think we should take that very seriously. And I'm sick of this discussion about what a great essayist he was, and that we're apologizing about his novels. I think there's all kinds of hocus pocus related to sexuality, especially, but also related to all kinds of politics, which have kept us in that position. Now we need to get out of that position. But in Just Above My Head is a space where now, in the full depth of his career in artistic practice, he's allowing his family in full participation in those energies in a way unlike anything he ever did. And it's part of why he was so terrified by that book, but it has everything to do with the church of that book, you know, operating in the way you so beautifully described it, Imani, just now. And, you know, I'm going on about that too, but I won't. But I think Amazing Grace and Just Above My Head are similar in that way, that for both artists, there was a network of connection, you know, a revivified nervous system, almost a vascular system that was reconnected in both those venues. For Baldwin from 75 to 79, when he was writing that in France for the most part and taking time off in the United States, and then Aretha going back to do those nights that became Amazing Grace, that put them in a place that was very different from the places they had been in their already incredible careers and lives. Yeah, so that's similar. But wow, it just the film is just such an incredible thing to have. I'm so glad we were able to in our lifetimes. You know, and there are, I have to say, there are pieces of Baldwin's life and work that I think are very similar to that, which I hope people can, that I've had the experience with, that I hope people in widespread numbers will be able to encounter in their lives. We need it, some fierce. Yeah.
Imani, I think you were going to say something. Please.
I don't want to ruin the flow because that's a beautiful way to sum it up. But I have been obsessing with, since I started reading Just Above My Head again, Paul Mooney's little bit where he used to say, how are we going to get through it? We're going to get through it like we always got through everything else. We're going to hum our way through it. And I feel like Just Above My Head is humming, Baldwin humming. It's resonating inside with him and with his people and family in a way that the other work alludes to, but doesn't aggressively pursue that kind of internal acoustic. And similarly, Aretha, in that film, we see something we heard a hint of, but we really can see it now in the footage on celluloid, that she's humming her way through it. And it's always applicable. And that has an actual physiological truth, that the polyvagal system is navigated and monitored by a hum. You can direct your mind and yourself and your psyche back to a safe place by humming or singing or playing a wind instrument, all of which are things that, you know, really take on this experience of being alive, of breathing in a special way. Wow. And who did that better than Aretha? Wow. And who described it and wrote it and illuminated it for us better than Baldwin?
That's incredible. And thank you for making the distinction between the film and the album, and kind of pulling out the distinctions between the album, the film, and the extended versions of the album, and how they fare in comparison. And isn't it amazing, no pun intended, to think about 1972's Amazing Grace, right, which was ruminating in 71, and 1979's Just Above My Head as bookends, right, to that decade. And so I would like to end actually by saying that, this conversation is important to me because of how it expands our understanding of Baldwin out and beyond The Fire Next Time, which I feel like is a text that kind of clips, right, his body of work. The quotes tend to be pulled from this text, and in the 60s in general, again, to the detriment, erasure, and exclusion of Baldwin in the 50s, 70s, and 80s, right? His commentary on Reagan, AIDS, and Michael Jackson, right, in the 1980s. His work,
you know?
Right. And so that is why this conversation is important to me, is that I hope that it inspires us to stretch him beyond the limitations of America's literary imagination of who he is, where he is frozen in time. And, you know, he referred to himself as a transnational commuter, which is something that I can relate to as an artist who was born and raised in LA and who was living between Amsterdam and London. And what becomes clear when you are a transnational commuter is where you call home, right? And it is without a doubt that I understand that Harlem was home, that Harlem was home, that his heart was based in Harlem. He was born in Harlem Hospital. His papers are at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture across the street from the Harlem Hospital, right? And so Harlem was his home. And if Harlem is his home, then music and jazz and gospel is in his heart. He is made of music, and it is an honor to have had this conversation with you all. I am already thinking about how we can form a Baldwin retreat and bring what we know and learn what we don't, and benefit from the fact that folks like Dinah, Aretha, Billie, Bessie, and Baldwin continue to give us, right, the information we need, the secrets to survival, answers and solutions and responses to the now, and the fact that Baldwin reminded us to think about the uses of the blues, right, as a way to kind of dig through some of these larger questions. So I would just like to say thank you all so much. I admire you so much. I've learned so much from you. And I wanted to once again think about Imani as a diasporic force in this, because I think that that's important when we're talking about Baldwin as a transnational commuter, plus his relationship to Africa and to the Caribbean. And so I just wanted to highlight that again, because that is a huge, again, hidden part of his legacy and conversation. And then the expansive and transformative research that Ed has done, and that will continue to grow me as a Baldwin, not scholar, but a Baldwin student. And so thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you both so much for what you bring and who you are. And thank you for your palpable love for this creature and the ways in which his hands and his minds stretch across disciplines. So I would just like to say thank you for a final time. I can't say it enough, if I'm honest.
No, thank you.
I thank you. I thank you, Ed.
Yeah, no, it's really, really a pleasure. Really a pleasure. We can do it again. We should do it again.
Yeah, we should. We should.
Right now, we get 10 minutes. Let's do it again.
Right. And we could, if I'm honest.
Oh yeah, yes.
Right. So with ease. Oh, I'm sorry. There is one final thing that I have to acknowledge because both of you touched on it, and that is the dance floor. The dance floor as a place of sanctuary, but also house music as church. Church as verb, DJ as conductor, DJ as deacon, dance floor as congregation. Dance floor as congregation, house music as gospel.
That's right.
So let us just end there, and I will see you all soon somewhere in this world. Thank you.
Peace, guys.
Thank you.